Hello, my name is Carmen.Garcia, and I currently work as an academic tutor at the Family Therapy section at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neurosciences, King's College London. Here I would like to present some ideas about how rhetorical questions emerging in the course of consultations or during teaching and learning sessions can be looked at or used in a particularly different way to develop learning further. Questions like this: what are they like? But what do I know? Who cares? What did I do that for? Who's gonna believe me? What can I do? Questions like these are often uttered in the context of consultations about problems that remain unresolved or situations that are perceived as stuck. And they are often bypassed because they are rhetorical questions. That is, questions that are not intended as such, or questions that do not look for an answer in the course of the conversation, at least. However, they might orient us out of the stuck situation if we attend to the paradox that they point out, and if we attend to it with a sense of curiosity rather than with an intent to dissolve the paradox. I would like to illustrate the ideas I'm proposing in this presentation with a vignette from my practice, and I have chosen a vignette of the first time I was inspired to attempt to answer a rhetorical question. This happened in the context of supervisory training in family therapy. For those of you who are not familiar with this modality of training, most systemic family therapy training happens by doing. That is, a therapist will be meeting a family or even role-playing as a therapist with a group of students that will be role-playing a family, and the supervisor observes and provides feedback in the moment to support the students' learning, applying concepts or discussing what happened in terms of process, techniques, and systemic family therapy concepts. So this was the context in which I attempted to, or I invited someone for the first time to reply to a rhetorical question. So more specifically, this trainee was working with a family who had requested consultations in relation to concerns about how their decision to separate could affect their children's emotional well-being. And more specifically, they felt stuck at the point of whether to tell them and how to tell them. So the therapists have had a few consultations with the couple only, without the children, and they seem to have come to a decision to tell the children, and they wanted to do it in the context of a session, a consultation session, because they felt that would be appropriate, or that was a way that felt good enough for them. However, we started to develop a pattern by which, at the end of a couple consultation, the decision will be made that the following session will be attended by the parents with the children, and yet they will come to that session without the children. So this situation repeated for at least 3 sessions. And at the time where this story starts, we were preparing for a session that we expected to be with the parents and the children. As we were discussing our ideas in preparation for the session, we saw from the window, the student saw from the window that the parents had arrived, and they were coming to the building without the children. So seeing this, the student blushed only lightly and exclaimed, "What are they like?" And as she did that, she started quickly preparing to dismiss her own question and prepare for a session with the couple alone. Seeing that, I proposed her to take her own question seriously. We have no time to prepare again for the circumstances, and that might be leading us to yet another repetition of this instance in this pattern. So we decided to try and answer that question. What are they like? Let me stop here, and we will continue using this vignette to illustrate some of the points I'm proposing in this presentation. In this presentation, I will attend to some extent to cultural norms around questions, to questions located in the space between knowing and not knowing, and that is, when we ask a question, we are not asserting any truth or being definite about any knowledge or any notion that we know something. And we are moving towards those aspects of experience or reality that we don't know yet. So the question can be located in a space between knowing and not knowing, because you need to know something in order to formulate a question, but the question is not about something that you know, at least not yet. It orients us in that direction towards what we know with an intent, at least, to produce some new knowledge, or perhaps to confirm or disconfirm some previous knowledge. Therefore, in that sense, questions can also be located in the very process of learning. And indeed, the classroom space or learning contexts are very familiar with the process of questioning. Questions presume as well a relationship, if not between two people in dialogue, someone who asks a question to someone else. They can presume anyway a relationship between the questioner, the person who asks the question, and that person's reality, world, or environment. I wonder about this. So for this presentation, I'll be focusing more on the use of questions in the teaching and learning relationship, with attention to the particular kind of questions that are rhetorical questions. So how are rhetorical questions a paradox? Well, they are a paradox because in a rhetorical question, two terms of a contradiction, or what could be seen as a contradiction, are presented as competing demands. We have to choose either one or the other meaning, and they cannot be contemplated together. There is a cultural norm that dictates that the two terms in a sentence or any reading of a situation cannot be contradictory in order to make sense. So how do we then take the idea of a question that is not meant to be answered, a question that is asked as a question, even though it's not really a question? So the culture of sense-making sanctions the fluidity of speech, as I was saying, as not contradictory. For what we say to make sense, we cannot contradict ourselves. In this way, when we have a question that is not really intended as a question, and we understand that in the way the question is communicated or uttered, and sometimes we can understand it in a written question, but I guess we need to imagine that question being announced in order to understand that is not really a question, or that that question doesn't require really an answer. So because of this sort of prohibition that for a discourse to make sense, its terms cannot be contradicting each other. We tend to choose one aspect of this question, that is, it is not really a question, and we contextualize that, reframing them as rhetorical. Okay, so for these reasons, or this understanding of how do we make sense when we talk or when we communicate verbally, responding rhetorical questions could be seen as countercultural. Indeed, rhetorical questions, as we've seen, are not meant to be answered, but yet they are announced as questions. Why would we be announcing something that we're not looking an answer for as a question? That was what caught my attention. What is in this paradox that might be of value? I started asking around and looking at this idea of the rhetorical question, and I found that they exist in numerous languages, including languages that do not use a linear graphic system like most Indo-European languages, whatever the direction of the line, so whether it's written from top to bottom, from left to right, right to left, or even, I don't know any language that is written from bottom to top, but who knows? I don't know all of the languages in the world. However, I haven't come across a language or a speaker that has disconfirmed the existence of rhetorical questions, that is, questions that do not intend an answer. We normally respond to the metacommunication about the rhetorical question. That is, the metacommunication is a message about the message. So I ask the question, but also in the way I ask the question, I am communicating that is not really intended as a question. So we tend to prioritize that metacommunication, the fact that this is not really a question. But what if we disregarded that metacommunication and attempted to answer the question? So my experience as an English speaker of other languages, as we are called here in the UK context where I work and live, tells me that when you do that, when you try and answer a question that was rhetorical, a certain awkwardness or non sequitur happens in the conversation that reveals to you that the other was not looking for an answer, that was indeed a rhetorical question. However, in a social context where different social rules apply, or where social rules apply differently, whichever order you prefer to put those terms on, such as the context of a therapy session or a consultation or a teaching and learning context, this process can be inverted, and rather than a non sequitur, answering a rhetorical question can help precisely with the process of development and change the situation that initially was perceived as a stalemate or frustratingly stuck, for which the consultation was required or which is being explored in a teaching and learning context. Let's now consider for a moment rhetorical questions in teaching and learning contexts. In most educational traditions, at least most of those I have had experience of or heard about or read about, teachers' questions are often rhetorical. That is, the teacher knows the answer to the question. Perhaps they are not strictly rhetorical in that the student might attempt an answer to the question, and that is the expectation. However, there is an idea that the teacher has a sense of what the answer is. So at least from the teacher's perspective, the question is rhetorical. And the intent might be to stimulate a search process in the students, or to confirm that the student has grasped some ideas, or to confirm learning, or understand whether where the student is in relation to the learning outcomes for the session, or for the teaching practice. My interest here, or my proposition to consider rhetorical questions in a teaching and learning context relates more to a framework of teaching and learning that is collaborative. In that sense, there is an inversion of that schema that I just described, because here the rhetorical question will not come necessarily from the teacher. And indeed, it does come from the person in the position of the student in the process of making sense of a given dilemma. But it's not a curious it's not a curious question. It's not a question that is asked in order to find out or to obtain some answers. It's rather an emotional question or an emotional expression that comes in the form of a question. The technique I have developed in the form of a protocol, and that I'm proposing here, hits to this emotional aspect in the rhetorical question, and makes room for some curiosity about what the question might encapsulate if we open it up. The teacher does not know the answer. The student does not know the answer yet. But both might engage in a process of interrogating the question itself and develop some new knowledge or some new or different understandings collaboratively. So what is this technique or protocol I've been referring to? The how-to. Well, over the years since that initial instance that I described in the vignette, where I proposed someone to attempt to reply a question that came out as rhetorical, some form of a pattern has been taking shape, which made me think of this process as a technique or as a protocol that is simple enough. Well, it's rigid because it repeats in different situations over time and context, and is simple enough to be flexibly applied in a variety of contexts or situations, such as the one in the case of the vignette, like training of systemic family therapy, or in therapy sessions as such, or consultations, or teaching and learning sessions that I'm developing from a situation that is perceived as stuck. So what would be the initial step? The initial step requires a teacher's disposition, or the consultant's disposition, or synchronization towards the sound of rhetorical questions. And that is because, as I was saying earlier, to answer a rhetorical question is countercultural. So rhetorical questions are often announced quickly and bypass the conscious attention or the critical awareness of those in conversation. So they are often dismissed because they are intended to be dismissed. In order to propose to answer a rhetorical question, one needs to develop some form of alertness towards them. They can be indeed proposed at the beginning of a consultation before the rhetorical question is uttered. And it can be useful. I have indeed experienced that. However, it has sounded somehow artificial because the person who is bringing the question is aware that this is an expectation. So it might not have the effect that it would have if the question is uttered or it emerges more spontaneously without it having been planned in that sense. So the consultation is on process, the dilemmas are being described, and in that process the student asks a rhetorical question. The teacher highlights it and just brings attention to the fact that that question was a question, but it didn't look as if the other wanted an answer or was asking for an answer, and proposes to instead attend answers to that question, as it might reveal something that is connected with the questions of the consultation. So it might be useful. There is a note here that I want a note of caution, as it may, because and is related to the idea that the rhetorical question is uttered with an emotional emphasis that might connect with some values that the consultee holds dear. And in that sense, there might be some respect to the fact that it is announced as a rhetorical question, and that the person who is asking it might not necessarily be willing to open or to explore further those connections. So it might take some renegotiation. And indeed, if the person in the consultation declines it, or is somehow titubant, or and that might be expressed, saying, "Well, I don't know," or by asking many questions about that proposal, my recommendation would be to let it go and accept to proceed without looking into that rhetorical question. Perhaps that can be done by saying, well, we don't really need to do it if you are not interested, or if it doesn't make sense to you. We might go back to it at a later point if you change your mind, or you might want to explore it on your own or with someone else, or not at all. This is in the spirit of learning as collaboration, and that the responsibility for the process of the consultation is shared. That is not the same to say that teacher and student or consultant are constantly coming to that situation from the same position or with the same responsibilities, but indeed the process of the consultation or the learning process can be a collaboration in that sense. So if it is agreed to look into that question with curiosity, to interrogate the question, as it were, attempts to answer the question together, reconnecting with the conversation or situation about which the rhetorical question was uttered, can proceed. So to continue with the illustration based on the earlier vignette, to the question, what are they like? We attempted some answers. So what were they like? They were a couple of a particular generation and in a particular cultural context. This couple was an English couple, as was the therapist, an English person. And this couple was a couple who thought that their children's views and opinions were valid. They were interested on informing their decisions as parents based on their children's wishes and views. However, the dilemma contrasted another value, perhaps, that it is not for the children to decide what the parental couple does. That's not their territory, or it might be difficult for the children to be placed in a situation where they are consulted about the couple relationship by their parents. That was where they felt stuck, and some of the reasons why they had requested consultations with a systemic family therapist. These values resonated with an English formulation which was familiar to the therapist as well, which goes with the saying, children are to be seen but not heard. And in the generation of the parents and the therapist, this was being questioned and challenged, and there was an interest on children's views, and they indeed wanted to hear children. So in the 5 minutes that it took, 5 to 10 minutes that it took the couple to come up to the consulting room, we had little time but to recognize that they were a couple that indeed wanted to hear their children's voices, but at the same time they didn't want to kind of place responsibilities on the children that could be overwhelming for them. Indeed, in that sense, the therapist and the couple agreed very much. It was very much because they agreed rather than because they disagreed that the situation was stuck. And that's all we had time to do before the session with the couple. The session went ahead, and that was the last session they came to without the children. For after this one, they came with the children, and the therapy sessions continued in their own course. So that was my experience then. That prompted my curiosity about what happened there, what difference did that do. I have been proposing it in different contexts, and indeed they have always led the process into a different place. I don't want to generalize here because this is really not the point of this presentation, and I haven't really looked into this with a structure of research or attempting to generalize. But it is my experience that if the times that I have interrogated rhetorical questions, a pattern of repetition, a pattern that felt stuck and that was felt with frustration has changed. So that's why I decided to propose it in this conference of education as relating. And here I end this presentation. I want to thank you for having attended it. If you have come to this point, and in this slide there's my contact email if you want to discuss what I'm proposing here with me, or if you have any questions in regard, I'll be willing to engage in a conversation with you about this. Thank you.